Sarah Martinez adjusted her civilian clothes as she walked into Murphy's bar, grateful for a rare weekend off from her classified duties. After 18 months of deep-cover operations that she couldn't discuss with anyone, she craved normalcy. The dimly lit establishment buzzed with typical Friday night energy. College students celebrating the end of finals, office workers unwinding, and scattered military personnel from the nearby base enjoying their liberty. She chose a corner booth where she could observe the room while appearing relaxed. Old habits died hard, even during downtime. The bartender, a friendly woman in her 50s, brought over the club soda Sarah had ordered. No alcohol, another ingrained habit from years of staying mission-ready. "You look like you could use something stronger than soda water," the bartender commented with a knowing smile. Sarah returned the smile. "Long week at work, I'm driving tonight anyway." "Smart girl, too many folks around here don't think that through." The bartender glanced toward a group of rowdy Marines near the pool table. "Some of these boys forget their manners when they've had a few." Sarah followed her gaze to the Marines. She recognized the type immediately: young, aggressive, probably fresh from their first deployment. They wore their confidence like armor, the kind that came from basic training and boot camp stories rather than real combat experience. Their voices carried across the bar as they boasted about conquests both military and romantic. "I can handle myself," Sarah said quietly, meaning it in ways the bartender couldn't imagine. For the next hour, Sarah enjoyed the peaceful anonymity. She scrolled through her phone, reading news articles about a world that seemed increasingly chaotic. Her specialized unit worked in the shadows to prevent the worst of that chaos from reaching American soil, but nights like this reminded her what they were fighting to protect. The trouble started when one of the Marines, a corporal named Jake Morrison, according to his loud introductions, approached her table. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of swagger that suggested he'd never met a problem he couldn't solve with aggression. "Hey there, beautiful," Morrison said, sliding uninvited into the booth across from her. "You look lonely over here by yourself." Sarah looked up from her phone with practiced politeness. "Actually, I'm enjoying the quiet, thanks though." Morrison's grin widened. "Come on, don't be like that. I'm Jake and you are." "Not interested," Sarah replied firmly but still politely. She'd learned that escalation rarely helped in these situations. "Ouch," Morrison laughed, but his eyes showed irritation. "Look, I'm a Marine. I just got back from deployment. I think I deserve a little conversation from a pretty girl." Sarah set down her phone and looked at him directly. "Your service is appreciated, but that doesn't entitle you to my time or conversation. I'd like to be left alone." Morrison's expression darkened. "You know what your problem is? You think you're better than everyone else. I bet you've never done anything important in your life." The irony wasn't lost on Sarah. 3 weeks ago, she'd been in an undisclosed location, extracting intelligence that prevented a terrorist attack on a major American city. But Morrison couldn't know that, and she couldn't tell him. "I'm going to ask you one more time to leave me alone," she said, her voice remaining calm despite growing tension. Morrison leaned forward aggressively. "And if I don't, what are you going to do about it, princess?" Sarah noticed the bartender watching nervously and several other patrons beginning to stare. Morrison's Marine buddies were laughing and egging him on from across the room. She calculated her options quickly: de-escalate, leave, or prepare for confrontation. "I'll call the bartender over and ask her to have you removed," Sarah said evenly. Morrison laughed harshly. "That old lady? Please, look around, sweetheart. This is a military town. Nobody's going to side with some stuck-up civilian over a Marine." He reached across the table and grabbed her wrist. "You're going to have a drink with me and be nice about it." Sarah's training kicked in immediately, but she forced herself to remain still. She could break Morrison's grip in 3 different ways, each progressively more painful, but revealing her capabilities would raise questions she couldn't answer. Instead, she spoke clearly enough for nearby tables to hear. "Let go of my wrist, now." "Make me," Morrison sneered, tightening his grip. That's when Sarah made her decision. She twisted her wrist in a specific way that broke Morrison's grip using leverage rather than obvious force, making it look accidental. Morrison, surprised and embarrassed, immediately grabbed for her again, this time more aggressively. Sarah stood quickly, stepping back from the table. "Don't touch me again." Morrison stood as well, using his height advantage to intimidate. "You need to learn some respect. Maybe I should teach you some manners." The threat was clear, and Sarah knew she had witnesses. Whatever happened next, she'd warned him publicly and tried to de-escalate. Morrison stepped around the table, backing her toward the wall. "You're going to apologize for being rude, and then you're going to buy me and my buddies around," he said, moving closer. Sarah found herself with her back to the wall, Morrison looming over her. His breath smelled of beer and arrogance. She could see his friends gathering behind him, ready to support whatever he did next. "Last chance," she said quietly. "Walk away." Morrison laughed and reached out to grab her shoulder. "You don't give Marines orders, lady." What happened next took less than 3 seconds, but would be talked about in Murphy's bar for years to come. Morrison's hand never reached Sarah's shoulder. Instead, he found himself face down on the floor, his arm twisted behind his back in a control hold that caused excruciating pain without permanent damage. Sarah had moved with fluid precision that spoke of extensive training and real combat experience. The technique she used was taught only in specialized military units, though the average observer wouldn't recognize its sophistication. "I asked you nicely to leave me alone," Sarah said calmly, maintaining the hold. "I gave you multiple chances to walk away." Morrison struggled, but any movement increased his pain. "Get off me, this is assault." "Actually," Sarah replied conversationally, "you threatened me, backed me against a wall, and attempted to grab me without consent after I repeatedly asked you to stop. Multiple witnesses heard me warn you. This is self-defense." The bar had gone quiet except for Morrison's grunts of pain. His fellow Marines stood frozen, unsure whether to intervene. Sarah's technique was so precise they couldn't quite figure out how she'd gotten Morrison on the ground so quickly. The bartender hurried over. "Should I call the police?" Sarah looked at Morrison, who was still trying unsuccessfully to break free. "That depends. Are you going to leave me alone now?" Yes, just let me go," Morrison gasped. Sarah released the hold and stepped back smoothly. Morrison scrambled to his feet, his face red with pain and embarrassment. He massaged his shoulder, glaring at her with wounded pride. "This isn't over," he muttered. "Yes, it is," Sarah replied firmly. "If you approach me again, I'll file a police report. You assaulted me first, and everyone here saw it." Morrison looked around the bar, realizing that the crowd's sympathy wasn't with him. His own fellow Marine seemed more impressed than supportive. One of them, a sergeant, stepped forward. "Morrison, stand down. You're making us all look bad." "She attacked me," Morrison protested. "After you grabbed her and threatened her," the sergeant replied coldly. "I heard the whole thing. You're out of line." Morrison's face cycled through anger, embarrassment, and confusion. He clearly couldn't understand how a civilian woman had overpowered him so easily. Finally, his wounded pride won out. "This is bullshit," he snarled at Sarah. "You think you're tough, I'll show you tough." Before anyone could react, Morrison lunged forward with a wild swing aimed at Sarah's face. This time, her response was less restrained. She sidestepped the punch, caught Morrison's extended arm, and used his momentum to send him crashing into a nearby table. Bottles and glasses shattered as Morrison hit the ground hard. The bar erupted in chaos. Morrison's friends moved forward, unsure whether to help him or confront Sarah. Other patrons backed away, and someone shouted about calling 911. Sarah remained calm in the center of the storm, her hands relaxed at her sides, but her stance suggesting she was ready for whatever came next. Morrison groaned on the floor among the broken glass, holding his ribs where he'd hit the table edge. "Everybody stay calm," Sarah announced to the room. "This man assaulted me twice after multiple warnings. I defended myself with appropriate force. If anyone else wants to make this a bigger problem, we can wait for the police together." The sergeant who'd tried to control Morrison earlier stepped forward with his hands visible and empty. "Ma'am, I apologize for my Marine's behavior. We'll get him out of here and handle this through military channels." Sarah studied the sergeant's face, recognizing the professionalism that Morrison lacked. "I appreciate that, but assault is a civilian matter too. I want a police report filed." Morrison struggled to sit up, glass crunching under him. "You're going to regret this, bitch. Do you have any idea who you're messing with?" Sarah looked down at him with something approaching pity. "Actually, I think the question is whether you know who you're messing with." The statement hung in the air with quiet authority that made several people uncomfortable. Morrison sensed something in her tone that his alcohol-impaired judgment couldn't quite process. Police sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. The bartender had called them during the second altercation. Sarah remained standing while Morrison's friends helped him to his feet, all of them shooting confused and angry glances in her direction. "I don't understand," Morrison said, swaying slightly. "You're just some civilian. How did you—" "Drop it, Morrison," the sergeant interrupted sharply. "You've done enough damage." But Morrison was beyond listening to reason. The combination of alcohol, injured pride, and genuine confusion had pushed him past rational thought. He shook off his friend's supporting hands and pointed an accusatory finger at Sarah. "There's something wrong here. Normal people don't move like that. What are you, some kind of cop or something?" Sarah met his gaze steadily. "I'm someone who asked you politely to leave me alone. That should have been enough." Two police officers entered the bar, their presence immediately changing the atmosphere. The younger officer began taking statements from witnesses while his partner approached Sarah and Morrison. "I'm Officer Reynolds," the senior policeman said. "We got a call about an assault. Who wants to tell me what happened?" Morrison spoke first, his words slurred but his indignation clear. "This woman attacked me for no reason. I was just trying to be friendly and she went psycho on me." Officer Reynolds looked at the broken glass, then at Morrison's disheveled appearance and Sarah's composed demeanor. "Is that your version of events, ma'am?" Sarah nodded toward the bartender and several witnesses. "These people saw the entire incident. Mr. Morrison grabbed my wrist after I repeatedly asked him to leave me alone. When I broke free, he threatened me and backed me against the wall. Then he attempted to strike me and I defended myself." The bartender stepped forward. "Officer, I saw it all. The young lady was polite and clear about wanting to be left alone. That Marine kept pushing it until she had to protect herself." Other witnesses nodded agreement and Morrison's face grew redder. "That's not, I barely touched her, but look what she did to me." Officer Reynolds examined Morrison's condition more closely. "You're saying this woman, who's about a foot shorter and probably 60 pounds lighter than you, did all this damage?" "She must know karate or something," Morrison muttered. "Do you know martial arts, ma'am?" Officer Reynolds asked Sarah. "I've had some self-defense training," Sarah replied carefully. "Enough to protect myself when necessary." It was technically true, though calling years of specialized military combat training some self-defense training was like calling a nuclear submarine a boat. But Sarah couldn't reveal the extent of her capabilities without raising questions about her background that she wasn't authorized to answer. Officer Reynolds took detailed statements from multiple witnesses, all of whom corroborated Sarah's account. Morrison's own friends reluctantly admitted their fellow Marine had been aggressive and inappropriate. "Mr. Morrison, you're being charged with assault and battery," Officer Reynolds announced. "You're also publicly intoxicated and disturbing the peace." "This is ridiculous," Morrison protested as handcuffs clicked around his wrists. "She's the one who attacked me." "After you assaulted her first," Officer Reynolds replied firmly. "Multiple witnesses confirm you grabbed her wrist, threatened her, and threw a punch. What happened after that was legal self-defense." As Morrison was led away, he turned back to Sarah with a mixture of anger and bewilderment that would haunt him for days. "This isn't over. I'll find out who you really are." Sarah watched him go with professional detachment. She'd handled the situation as well as possible under the circumstances, but Morrison's threats suggested he wouldn't let it drop. That could become a problem if he started digging into her background. Officer Reynolds approached her with a business card. "If he bothers you again, call immediately. Some guys don't know when to quit." "I understand," Sarah said, accepting the card. "Thank you for responding quickly." After the police left and the bar began returning to normal, Sarah gathered her things to leave. The bartender waved away her attempt to pay for the club soda. "On the house, honey. I've never seen someone handle a troublemaker that smoothly. Where'd you learn to do that?" Sarah smiled enigmatically. "You pick things up here and there." As she walked to her car, Sarah's mind was already working through potential complications. Morrison was clearly the type to hold grudges, and his confusion about her capabilities might drive him to investigate further. If he started asking the right people the right questions, he might eventually connect her to military units that officially didn't exist. She'd have to mention the incident in her next security briefing. Her handlers needed to know about any civilian contacts that might compromise her cover, especially ones involving law enforcement reports. Sarah drove home through the quiet streets, reflecting on the evening's events. She joined the military to serve her country and had excelled beyond her wildest expectations. The specialized training, the classified missions, the knowledge that her work prevented disasters most Americans would never know about. It all gave her life purpose and meaning. But nights like this reminded her of the costs. She couldn't have normal relationships when her life was built on necessary deceptions. She couldn't tell anyone what she really did or where she'd been. And she certainly couldn't explain to some drunken Marine that his victim had killed enemy combatants in 3 different countries over the past year. The irony would have been amusing if it weren't so isolating. Morrison had called her just some civilian, while threatening a soldier whose service record would probably never be declassified. He demanded respect for his military service from someone whose military service was far more extensive and dangerous than his own. Sarah parked outside her modest apartment complex and sat in the car for a moment, processing the evening. Tomorrow, she'd return to her cover job as a logistics coordinator for a defense contractor. Monday morning, she'd attend mundane meetings and file boring reports, maintaining the facade that protected her real work. But tonight had been a reminder that even the most carefully constructed cover could be threatened by random encounters with people too stubborn or drunk to accept simple rejection. Morrison's parting words echoed in her mind. "I'll find out who you really are." She hoped he was just blowing off steam, but her training had taught her to prepare for the worst. If Morrison decided to make good on his threats, the consequences could extend far beyond a bar fight. National security operations could be compromised, ongoing missions could be endangered, and lives could be lost. All because a Marine couldn't handle being told no by a woman he assumed was defenseless. Sarah locked her car and walked toward her apartment, already planning her report for Monday's briefing. Some threats came from foreign enemies with sophisticated intelligence networks. Others came from drunk young men with wounded pride and too much time on their hands. In her experience, the second type could sometimes be more dangerous than the first. Jake Morrison sat in the military police station, nursing his bruised ribs and wounded pride while his commanding officer reviewed the incident report. Captain Williams had been less than sympathetic when he'd arrived to collect his wayward Marine from civilian custody. "So let me understand this correctly, Morrison," Captain Williams said, setting down the police report. "You assaulted a civilian woman half your size and somehow ended up being the one who got arrested." Morrison shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The previous night's alcohol had worn off, leaving him with a pounding headache and crystal-clear memories of his humiliation. "Sir, there was something wrong about the whole situation. Normal people don't fight like that." "Fight like what, Morrison? According to these witness statements, you grabbed her wrist, she broke free, then you lunged at her and ended up on the floor. That sounds like you got your ass kicked by someone who actually knows how to defend herself." "But sir, the way she moved, it wasn't normal self-defense. She put me down like she'd done it 1,000 times before, and when I tried to hit her, it was like she knew exactly what I was going to do." Captain Williams leaned back in his chair, studying Morrison with the expression of a man who'd seen too many young Marines make stupid decisions. "Morrison, you're 22 years old. You've been in the Corps for less than 3 years. Your combat experience consists of one relatively quiet deployment to Jordan. Is it possible that you're simply not as tough as you think you are?" The question stung because Morrison couldn't entirely dismiss it. His deployment had been largely uneventful, perimeter security and routine patrols with minimal action. Most of his fighting experience came from training and bar fights, not actual combat. "I know what I saw, sir. She moved like someone with serious training, military training." Captain Williams frowned. "What are you suggesting, Morrison? That this woman is some kind of undercover soldier? Do you realize how paranoid that sounds?" "I'm not saying she's undercover, sir, but maybe she's prior service or military police or married to someone on base. There has to be some explanation." "The explanation is that you picked on the wrong woman and paid for it. Case closed." But Morrison couldn't let it go. The memory of being effortlessly controlled by someone he'd assumed was helpless gnawed at him. He'd always prided himself on being a warrior, a protector, a man who could handle any physical threat. Having that self-image shattered by a woman drinking club soda in a corner booth was too much for his ego to process. After his meeting with Captain Williams, Morrison returned to the barracks and found his squad mates waiting with a mixture of curiosity and amusement. Word of his arrest had spread quickly through the unit. "So Morrison," said Corporal Davis with a grin, "heard you got taken down by a girl. Want to tell us how that happened?" Morrison scowled. "Shut up, Davis, you weren't there." "Actually, I was," said Sergeant Torres, who'd been part of the group at Murphy's bar. "And I've been thinking about what I saw. Davis is right, something was off about that whole thing." Morrison looked up hopefully. "You saw it too, right, the way she moved?" Torres nodded slowly. "I've been in the Corps for 8 years. I've seen plenty of bar fights, and I've seen actual combat. That woman didn't fight like someone with basic self-defense training. She fought like someone with advanced martial arts skills and real experience using them." "So what are you thinking?" Morrison asked. "I'm thinking maybe we should find out who she really is." The conversation continued throughout the day as Morrison's squadmates debated the incident. Some dismissed it as Morrison's bruised ego looking for excuses, but others had noticed details that bothered them. The precision of the woman's movements, the calm way she'd handled multiple opponents, the confidence in her voice when she'd warned Morrison, it all suggested someone with significant training and experience. By evening, Morrison had convinced himself that investigating the mysterious woman was not only justified but necessary. If she was connected to the military somehow, he had a right to know. If she wasn't, then he needed to understand how a civilian had acquired such formidable fighting skills. "I'm going back to that bar tonight," Morrison announced to his squad. "See if anyone knows anything about her." Sergeant Torres shook his head. "Bad idea, Morrison. You're already in trouble over this. Captain Williams told you to drop it." "I'm not going to cause any problems. I just want to ask some questions." "Questions about a woman who kicked your ass and had you arrested. That's definitely going to end well." But Morrison was beyond listening to reason. His pride demanded answers, and his curiosity had grown into obsession. He'd spent the entire day replaying the fight, analyzing every detail, trying to understand how someone so much smaller had dominated him so completely. That evening, Morrison returned to Murphy's bar, this time sober and alone. The atmosphere was different on Saturday night. Younger crowd, louder music, more civilian college students than military personnel. The bartender from the previous night wasn't working, replaced by a young man who didn't recognize Morrison. Morrison ordered a beer and struck up conversations with various patrons, fishing for information about the woman who'd humiliated him. Most people had no idea who he was talking about, but eventually he found a regular customer who'd witnessed the incident. "Oh, you mean Sarah," the man said. "Yeah, I saw what happened. That was impressive stuff." Morrison's pulse quickened. "Sarah, you know her name?" "Not personally, but she's been coming in here occasionally for the past few months. Always by herself, always orders club soda, keeps to herself mostly. Seems nice enough." "Do you know what she does for work, where she's from?" The man shrugged. "Never really talked to her. She's not much for conversation. But I'll tell you this, after seeing her handle you last night, I'd guess she's got some kind of background in security or law enforcement." Morrison pressed for more details, but the man knew little else. Sarah was a regular customer who paid in cash, didn't cause trouble, and generally avoided drawing attention to herself. The only unusual thing about her was her apparent ability to disable trained Marines without breaking a sweat. Frustrated but not deterred, Morrison spent the rest of the evening talking to bartenders, servers, and regular customers. Slowly, a picture began to emerge. Sarah had been coming to Murphy's bar for several months, always alone, always careful not to reveal personal information. She dressed casually but expensively, suggesting a good income. She was polite but distant, friendly but never familiar. Most intriguingly, several people mentioned that Sarah seemed hyper-aware of her surroundings in a way that suggested professional training. She always chose seats with good views of exits. She noticed when new people entered the bar, and she had an uncanny ability to sense when people were watching her. "She acts like someone in law enforcement," one regular customer observed. "Or maybe military. My brother's a cop, and he's got that same way of scanning a room." The more Morrison learned, the more convinced he became that Sarah was hiding something significant. Normal civilians didn't develop that level of situational awareness or fighting skill without extensive training and experience. She had to be connected to the military, law enforcement, or some other organization that required such capabilities. Over the following week, Morrison's unofficial investigation became an obsession. He returned to Murphy's bar multiple times, hoping to encounter Sarah again, but she never appeared. He asked around the local area, describing her to bartenders and servers at other establishments, but no one recognized his description. Morrison even went so far as to visit the civilian gym where many off-duty military personnel worked out, thinking Sarah might train there. The staff were polite but unhelpful, citing privacy policies when he asked about specific members. "Look, man," said the gym manager after Morrison's third visit, "I don't know who you're looking for, but this is getting weird. If you're trying to track down some woman who doesn't want to be found, maybe you should take the hint." The comment stung because Morrison was beginning to realize how his behavior appeared to others. He was a young Marine obsessively searching for a woman who defended herself against his assault. No matter how he framed it in his mind, the optics were terrible. But Morrison couldn't stop. The mystery of Sarah had taken over his thoughts, interfering with his duties and straining his relationships with his fellow Marines. He found himself constantly replaying their brief encounter, analyzing her words and actions for clues about her identity. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Morrison was having lunch at a diner near the base when he overheard a conversation between two civilian contractors discussing security clearances and background investigations. "The thing about black programs is that the people involved have to maintain perfect cover stories," one man was saying. "They can't afford to have their real identities compromised, so they create entire false personas." Morrison's ears perked up. Black programs, classified military operations that officially didn't exist. He'd heard rumors about such units during his training, elite soldiers who conducted missions so secret that even their existence was denied. "What kind of cover stories?" the second contractor asked. "Usually mundane jobs that explain their income and travel patterns but don't attract attention. Defense contractors, IT consultants, logistics coordinators, boring stuff that people don't ask questions about." Morrison felt a chill of recognition. Sarah had seemed educated and well-dressed, suggesting a professional job. Her hyper-awareness and fighting skills could be explained by military training. Her reluctance to discuss personal details fit the pattern of someone maintaining a cover identity. The more Morrison thought about it, the more the pieces seemed to fit. Sarah wasn't just a civilian with self-defense training. She was an active-duty soldier operating under deep cover. That would explain her capabilities, her caution, and her presence in a military town. It would also explain why she'd been so confident when dealing with him and the police. She wasn't worried about the legal consequences because she had resources and protection that ordinary civilians lacked. Morrison spent the rest of the afternoon researching special operations units online, trying to learn more about black programs and cover operations. Most of the information was speculation and rumors, but the basic concept was clear. Elite soldiers sometimes operated under civilian identities to conduct classified missions. If Sarah was part of such a unit, then Morrison's investigation was potentially dangerous for both of them. He could be interfering with national security operations, and she might take drastic action to protect her cover. But instead of deterring him, the possibility excited Morrison. If he was right about Sarah's true identity, then his humiliation took on a different meaning. He hadn't been beaten by some random civilian. He'd encountered a highly trained special operations soldier and lived to tell about it. The thought restored some of his wounded pride while simultaneously fueling his determination to learn more. Morrison began frequenting locations where he thought Sarah might appear: coffee shops near defense contractor offices, restaurants popular with military personnel, bookstores and libraries where educated professionals might spend their time. He told himself he just wanted to confirm his suspicions, but his behavior was becoming increasingly erratic. His performance at work suffered as he spent more time investigating Sarah than focusing on his duties. His squad mates grew concerned about his obsession with the mysterious woman. "Morrison, you need to let this go," Sergeant Torres warned during a training exercise. "You're making yourself look crazy, and you're starting to worry people." "I'm close to figuring it out," Morrison insisted. I think she's military, special operations maybe. Torres grabbed Morrison by the shoulder and pulled him aside. Listen to me carefully. Even if you're right, and that's a big if, what do you think happens next? You expose some classified operation? You compromise national security? You think that ends well for you? The warning gave Morrison pause, but his obsession had grown beyond rational thought. He'd invested too much time and energy in the investigation to abandon it now. Sarah had become a puzzle he was determined to solve, regardless of the consequences. That evening, Morrison made a decision that would prove fateful. Instead of continuing his random searches, he would take a more systematic approach. He would stake out Murphy's bar every night until Sarah returned, and when she did, he would confront her directly. He convinced himself that he deserved answers. She'd humiliated him publicly, damaged his reputation, and left him with questions that haunted his sleep. The least she could do was explain who she really was. Morrison didn't consider that Sarah might have very good reasons for maintaining her secrecy, or that his investigation might have already attracted the attention of people whose job it was to protect classified operations. He also didn't consider that confronting a potentially dangerous special operations soldier might be the worst mistake of his young life. As Morrison prepared for his stakeout, planning questions he would ask and scenarios he might encounter, Sarah was hundreds of miles away on a classified mission that would determine the fate of American hostages in a hostile foreign country. She had no idea that a drunken Marine's wounded pride had evolved into a security threat that could compromise years of careful preparation and endanger lives on multiple continents. The collision between Morrison's obsession and Sarah's classified world was inevitable, and when it came, the consequences would be far more serious than a simple bar fight. Sarah Martinez returned from her mission exhausted but successful. The hostage extraction in Eastern Europe had gone flawlessly, but 3 weeks of deep cover work in hostile territory had taken its toll. She craved normalcy, a reminder of why her dangerous work mattered. Murphy's bar seemed like the perfect place to decompress. She'd avoided it since the incident with the aggressive Marine, but enough time had passed that she hoped the situation had blown over. Her security briefing about the encounter had been routine. Her handlers noted the civilian contact, but weren't overly concerned about a drunk Marine with hurt feelings. That assessment would prove to be a serious miscalculation. Sarah entered the bar on a quiet Tuesday evening, choosing her usual corner booth and ordering her standard club soda. The familiar environment helped ease the psychological transition from her cover identity as a Bulgarian arms dealer back to her persona as an American logistics coordinator. She was reviewing news reports on her phone, catching up on 3 weeks of missed current events, when Jake Morrison approached her table. Well, Morrison said, sliding into the booth across from her without invitation. If it isn't the mysterious Sarah. Sarah looked up from her phone, recognizing Morrison immediately despite his attempt to appear casual and non-threatening. He was sober this time, but his presence triggered immediate alarm bells. Her training had taught her that persistent adversaries were often more dangerous than random threats. I thought I made myself clear last time, Sarah said calmly. I want to be left alone. Morrison raised his hands in a gesture of mock surrender. Relax, I'm not here to cause trouble, I just want to talk. We have nothing to talk about. I think we do. Morrison leaned forward with the confidence of someone who believed he held important cards. See, I've been doing some research since our last encounter, learning interesting things about special operations units and cover identities. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the bar's air conditioning. Morrison's words suggested he'd moved beyond casual curiosity into potentially dangerous territory. She assessed her options quickly, de-escalate, extract herself from the situation, or neutralize the threat. I don't know what you're talking about, she replied evenly. Morrison smiled with the satisfaction of someone who thought he'd gained the upper hand. Come on, Sarah, that's not even your real name, is it? People with your kind of training don't usually work as logistics coordinators for boring defense contractors. The fact that Morrison knew her cover job sent ice through Sarah's veins. He'd been conducting actual surveillance, not just asking random questions. This was no longer a case of wounded male pride. It had escalated into a potential security breach. You're obviously confused about something, Sarah said, beginning to gather her things. I'm going to leave now. Morrison reached across the table and placed his hand on her phone. Not yet. We're going to finish this conversation. The physical contact was a mistake. Sarah's hand moved with precise speed, applying pressure to specific nerve points that made Morrison's fingers go numb. He jerked his hand back, shaking it and staring at her with a mixture of pain and vindication. There it is again, Morrison said, his voice rising. Normal people don't know pressure points. Where did you learn that? Fort Bragg, Quantico, some classified training facility that doesn't officially exist. Sarah realized the situation was spiraling beyond her control. Morrison's investigation had clearly uncovered enough information to make him genuinely dangerous. She needed to extract herself immediately and report this security breach to her handlers. You need to stop this investigation, Sarah said quietly, for your own safety. Morrison's eyes lit up with triumph. So you admit you're not just some civilian, I knew it. You're military, aren't you? Special operations. Several other patrons had begun to notice their conversation, and Sarah saw the bartender glancing over with concern. She needed to end this encounter before it attracted more attention. Listen carefully, Sarah said, her voice taking on an edge that made Morrison lean back slightly. You're playing with forces you don't understand. Walk away now, forget about me, and focus on your own life and career. But Morrison had invested too much in his investigation to back down now. His wounded pride and genuine curiosity had evolved into something approaching obsession. I've already figured out enough to know you're lying about everything, Morrison said. Your job, your background, probably even your name. The question is, what are you going to do about it? Sarah felt the familiar calm that preceded violent action. Morrison had crossed multiple red lines and showed no intention of backing down. He'd conducted surveillance, gathered intelligence about her cover identity, and was now making implicit threats. Her training dictated a clear response. What am I going to do about it? Sarah repeated quietly. I'm going to give you one final chance to walk away and pretend this conversation never happened. Morrison laughed, but there was nervous edge to it. Something in Sarah's tone suggested he was approaching a line he really didn't want to cross. And if I don't, what then? You'll report me to your commanding officer, have me transferred somewhere unpleasant, maybe arrange for me to have an accident during training. The suggestions revealed how far Morrison's paranoia had progressed. He genuinely believed Sarah was part of some shadowy military unit capable of eliminating threats to operational security. He wasn't entirely wrong. What I'll do, Sarah said with quiet finality, is protect myself and my work from people who threaten them, by whatever means necessary. Morrison felt a chill at her words, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. He'd come too far to retreat now. So that's it, you're threatening me. I'm warning you, there's a difference. I'm not afraid of you, Morrison said, though his voice suggested otherwise. I'm a United States Marine. I've sworn an oath to protect this country from enemies foreign and domestic. Sarah almost smiled at the irony. So have I. The admission hung in the air between them, confirming Morrison's suspicions while raising new questions about Sarah's true allegiances and capabilities. So you are military, Morrison said triumphantly. I serve my country, Sarah replied carefully. The same country you claim to serve, which is why your investigation is so problematic. Morrison's expression grew confused. If Sarah was a fellow American soldier, why was she operating under a false identity? Why the secrecy and cover stories? I don't understand, Morrison admitted. If we're on the same side, then you should trust that some things are classified for good reasons, Sarah interrupted. And you should stop digging into matters that could get people killed. The words carried weight that made Morrison pause. For the first time since beginning his investigation, he considered that his actions might have consequences beyond satisfying his curiosity. People killed? What kind of operation are you involved in? Sarah stood up, her patience finally exhausted. Morrison's questions were becoming increasingly dangerous, and his persistence suggested he wouldn't be deterred by warnings alone. The kind that requires absolute secrecy to succeed, she said. The kind that protects American lives by preventing threats you'll never hear about on the news. The kind that can't afford to be compromised by Marines with hurt feelings and too much time on their hands. Morrison stood as well, unwilling to let her leave with so many questions unanswered. You can't just walk away. I deserve to know the truth. You deserve nothing, Sarah replied coldly. You assaulted me, threatened me, stalked me, and conducted unauthorized surveillance on an American intelligence operative. Any one of those actions could land you in military prison. All of them together could be considered treason. The word treason hit Morrison like a physical blow. He'd been so focused on solving the mystery of Sarah's identity that he hadn't considered the legal implications of his investigation. I was just trying to understand, he began. You were trying to feed your wounded ego, Sarah cut him off. And in the process, you've potentially compromised ongoing operations that protect American lives. Morrison felt the ground shifting beneath him as the full implications of Sarah's words sank in. If she really was an intelligence operative, then his investigation could indeed be considered a security breach. His commanding officers would be furious, his career would be over, and he could face serious criminal charges. What happens now? Morrison asked quietly. Sarah studied his face, seeing fear beginning to replace arrogance. It was a promising development, but she wasn't sure it was enough to guarantee his silence. That depends entirely on you, she said. This conversation never happened. You never saw me here tonight. You stop asking questions about me, stop visiting places where you think I might appear, and you never speak my name again. Morrison nodded quickly. Okay, yes, I can do that. And if you can't, if your curiosity gets the better of you again. Sarah let the question hang unanswered, but Morrison understood the implication. He'd pushed a dangerous person past the limits of their patience. Further harassment would have serious consequences. I'll forget all of this, Morrison promised. I'll tell my squad mates to drop it too. We'll pretend the whole thing never happened. Sarah reached into her purse and pulled out a business card with only a phone number printed on it. She set it on the table between them. If you remember anything about our conversations, if you feel compelled to share your theories with anyone else, if you even think my name too loudly, call that number first. Explain what you're planning to do and why. The person who answers will help you understand why it's a bad idea. Morrison stared at the card, afraid to touch it. Who will answer? Someone whose job it is to protect operations like mine from security breaches like you. The implicit threat was clear. Morrison had stumbled into the shadowy world of classified operations, and the people who ran that world took security very seriously. Morrison picked up the card with trembling fingers. I understand. This whole thing was a mistake. I was drunk, I was embarrassed, I let it go too far. Yes, you did. The question is whether you're smart enough to stop before it goes any further. Sarah turned to leave, but Morrison called after her. Wait, can I ask one question, just one? Against her better judgment, Sarah paused. Are you really protecting Americans? This isn't some illegal operation or conspiracy. Sarah looked back at him with something approaching sympathy. For all his flaws, Morrison was still a young Marine trying to serve his country honorably. Everything I do is in service to the United States of America and its citizens, she said, including protecting them from threats they'll never know existed. Your job is to trust that some people are fighting battles you can't see for reasons you can't understand. Morrison nodded, finally grasping the magnitude of what he'd stumbled into. Thank you for not destroying my career, or worse. Thank you for finally listening to reason. Sarah left the bar with mixed feelings. Morrison seemed genuinely chastened, but she'd had to reveal far more about herself than she was comfortable with. The incident would require a full security briefing, and her handlers might decide her cover identity was compromised. If they pulled her from operational status, months of preparation for upcoming missions would be wasted. Other operatives would have to take increased risks to compensate for her absence. American lives could be endangered because a drunk Marine couldn't handle rejection. As Sarah drove home, she reflected on the unforeseen vulnerabilities in her line of work. Enemy spies and hostile governments were expected threats that she was trained to handle, but random encounters with persistent Americans who couldn't mind their own business presented unique challenges. Morrison had forced her to make a difficult choice between operational security and personal safety. By threatening him, she'd protected her cover but revealed its existence. By showing mercy, she'd preserved her humanity but created a potential future threat. Time would tell which decision was the right one. Behind her, Morrison sat in the empty bar, staring at the business card and trying to process everything that had happened. His investigation had answered some questions while raising dozens of others, but one thing was clear. He'd narrowly avoided destroying his life by pursuing a woman far more dangerous than he'd ever imagined. The smart thing would be to go home, burn the card, and never think about Sarah again. But Morrison had never been accused of being particularly smart. The meeting took place in an unmarked government building 40 miles from the nearest military installation. Sarah sat across from Deputy Director Catherine Walsh, a woman whose unassuming appearance masked one of the sharpest intelligence minds in the country. "Tell me about Corporal Morrison," Walsh said, reviewing a thick file that had materialized with surprising speed. Sarah had spent 3 days preparing for this debriefing, knowing that her career hung in the balance. "He's a young Marine who let his pride overcome his judgment. The initial incident was straightforward harassment, but his subsequent investigation represents a potential security breach." Walsh nodded, continuing to read. "Our background check on Morrison is interesting. Clean service record, no disciplinary actions, above-average performance evaluations, but also young, impressionable, and evidently persistent to a fault." "He's not malicious," Sarah admitted. "Just stubborn and curious. Unfortunately, those can be dangerous qualities when applied to classified operations." "Indeed." Walsh closed the file and leaned back. "The question is what to do about it. Morrison now knows enough to compromise your cover identity and possibly enough to endanger ongoing operations if he shares his theories with the wrong people." Sarah had been dreading this conversation. She'd served her country faithfully for 8 years, conducting missions that saved countless American lives. The thought of being pulled from operational status because of one Marine's inability to accept rejection was infuriating. "Has he made any attempt to contact me since our last conversation?" Walsh asked. "No, he seems to understand the seriousness of the situation." "That's encouraging, but not necessarily decisive. Young men have a tendency to convince themselves they're braver than they actually are, especially given time to reflect on perceived slights." Walsh opened another file, this one containing surveillance photos of Morrison. "We've been monitoring his activities since your report. He's shown admirable restraint so far, but there are concerning signs." Sarah felt her stomach tighten. "What kind of signs?" "He's been asking subtle questions around the base about special operations units and classified programs. Nothing overt enough to trigger official attention, but the pattern suggests his curiosity hasn't been fully satisfied." "Are you pulling me from operations?" Walsh considered the question carefully. "That depends on several factors. Morrison's future behavior, obviously, but also your assessment of the threat he represents and your confidence in managing that threat." Sarah understood the subtext. Walsh was asking whether she could handle Morrison permanently if necessary. The euphemistic language didn't disguise the underlying question about whether an American Marine might need to disappear to protect national security. "I believe Morrison can be managed without extreme measures," Sarah said carefully. "He's not inherently malicious, and he genuinely wants to serve his country. He just needs to understand how his actions could undermine that service." "You're recommending continued monitoring rather than immediate action." "I'm recommending that we give him a chance to prove he can be trusted with partial knowledge of sensitive operations." Walsh raised an eyebrow. "Partial knowledge?" Sarah had spent considerable time thinking about this approach. Morrison's investigation was driven primarily by curiosity and wounded pride. If we satisfy the curiosity while appealing to his better instincts, we might be able to ensure his silence without resorting to more drastic measures. "You're suggesting we read him into certain aspects of your cover status." "I'm suggesting we let him think we have, while actually revealing nothing of operational value." Walsh smiled for the first time during the meeting. "Controlled disclosure. Give him enough truth to feel important while keeping actual secrets secure." "Exactly. Morrison wants to understand what happened to him and why. If we provide a plausible explanation that satisfies his curiosity while making him feel like a trusted guardian of important secrets, he's more likely to maintain operational security." "And if this approach fails? If Morrison proves unreliable despite our efforts to bring him into the fold?" Sarah met Walsh's gaze steadily. Then we reassess and take whatever action is necessary to protect ongoing operations. The euphemism hung in the air between them, acknowledged but not elaborated upon. Walsh made notes in her file for several minutes before speaking again. We'll try your approach, but with strict parameters. Morrison will be contacted by someone claiming to represent a classified military unit interested in his discretion regarding sensitive personnel. He'll be given a sanitized version of events that explains your capabilities without revealing operational details. Who will make contact? Someone with the appropriate credentials and authority to make the conversation seem legitimate. Morrison will be told that his silence is appreciated and that his country is grateful for his discretion in protecting the identities of personnel involved in classified work. Sarah nodded. It was a reasonable approach that played to Morrison's pride in his military service while giving him a face-saving explanation for his earlier humiliation. What if he asks specific questions about my unit or mission? He'll be told that such information is classified above his clearance level, but that his cooperation has been noted by senior leadership. Young Marines respond well to the suggestion that they're being considered for future special assignments. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Morrison would be made to feel important and trusted while actually learning nothing of intelligence value. His natural desire to serve would be redirected into protecting secrets he didn't actually possess. Timeline, Sarah asked. Contact will be made within 48 hours. We want to reach Morrison before his curiosity drives him to take any additional unauthorized actions. Sarah felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. She would remain operational, her cover would be protected, and Morrison would hopefully be neutralized as a threat without anyone's career being destroyed. Thank you for supporting this approach, she said. Walsh's expression grew serious. Don't thank me yet. This plan only works if Morrison proves trustworthy and discreet. If he betrays that trust, the consequences will be severe for both of you. The meeting concluded with Sarah being briefed on additional security protocols and communication procedures. Her cover identity would be modified slightly to account for Morrison's knowledge, but she would remain operational pending the success of their approach with the young Marine. As Sarah drove back to her apartment, she reflected on the strange turns her career had taken. She'd faced enemy agents, hostile governments, and life-threatening missions around the world. But her most dangerous adversary had turned out to be a drunk Marine in a small-town bar. Meanwhile, Morrison was experiencing his own form of psychological pressure. The business card Sarah had given him seemed to burn in his wallet, a constant reminder of how close he'd come to destroying his career and possibly his life. He'd resisted the urge to call the number, but his curiosity about its purpose had only grown stronger. Who would answer? What would they say? Was it a direct line to some shadowy government office, or simply a number that would confirm his theories about Sarah's true identity? Morrison's squad mates had noticed his distracted behavior and persistent questions about special operations units. Sergeant Torres had pulled him aside twice to warn about the dangers of obsessing over classified matters he couldn't understand. Whatever you think you've figured out, drop it, Torres had said. Some doors shouldn't be opened, especially by Marines who don't have the clearance or need to know what's behind them. But Morrison couldn't shake the feeling that he'd stumbled into something far more important than a simple bar fight. Sarah's reaction to his investigation suggested he'd discovered something genuinely significant, not just hurt the feelings of someone with martial arts training. The breakthrough came on Thursday evening when Morrison received a phone call that would change his understanding of everything that had happened. Corporal Morrison, this is Colonel James Mitchell. I understand you've had some interactions with one of our personnel. Morrison's blood ran cold. He recognized the tone of authority, and the careful phrasing that suggested this was exactly the kind of call he'd been both hopping for and dreading. Sir, I'm not sure what you're referring to, Morrison said carefully. The woman you encountered at Murphy's bar 3 weeks ago, the one who defended herself when you became aggressive. Morrison felt his world shifting again. An unknown colonel was calling him about Sarah, which confirmed that she was indeed connected to military operations at the highest levels. Yes, sir, I may have acted inappropriately that evening. You definitely acted inappropriately, Corporal, but that's not why I'm calling. I'm calling because your subsequent investigation into that person's identity has attracted our attention. Morrison swallowed hard. I wasn't trying to compromise anything, sir. I was just curious about what happened. I understand your curiosity, Morrison. What you experienced was unusual, and it's natural to seek explanations. But the person you encountered is involved in classified work that serves our national security interests. So she is military, sir? There was a pause before Colonel Mitchell answered. Let's say that she serves her country in ways that require absolute discretion and protection of her operational identity. Your investigation, however well-intentioned, represents a potential threat to ongoing operations that protect American lives. Morrison felt a mixture of vindication and terror. He'd been right about Sarah's military connection, but he'd also apparently stumbled into something far more serious than he'd imagined. I understand, sir. I'll stop asking questions and forget about the whole thing. I appreciate that commitment, Morrison, but we need more than a promise. We need your active cooperation in protecting this operative's cover and ensuring that no one else becomes curious about her identity. Morrison's pulse quickened. What kind of cooperation, sir? First, you'll never speak about this individual again, to anyone, under any circumstances. Second, if anyone else asks you about the incident at Murphy's bar, you'll characterize it as a simple misunderstanding between civilians that was quickly resolved. Yes, sir, absolutely. Third, if you ever encounter this operative again, you'll treat her as a complete stranger and avoid any interaction beyond basic politeness. Morrison nodded even though the colonel couldn't see him. I understand completely, sir. Good, Morrison, I want you to understand something important. The woman you encountered has saved American lives. Her work prevents terrorist attacks, rescues hostages, and protects this country from threats you'll never hear about on the news. Your discretion in this matter directly supports those life-saving operations. The words hit Morrison with unexpected force. He'd spent weeks focusing on his wounded pride and his curiosity about Sarah's identity. He hadn't considered that his investigation might be interfering with genuine national security operations. I had no idea the stakes were that high, sir. They always are in this line of work, which is why operational security is so critical. One careless word, one moment of curiosity shared with the wrong person, and people die. Morrison felt the full weight of his mistakes settling on his shoulders. His selfish desire to understand Sarah's abilities had potentially endangered the very operations he'd sworn to protect as a Marine. Is there anything I can do to make this right, sir? Colonel Mitchell's tone softened slightly. You can learn from this experience, Morrison. You can remember that sometimes the most important service you provide is knowing when not to ask questions. And you can take pride in protecting secrets that keep Americans safe, even when you don't fully understand what those secrets are. Morrison felt a strange sense of purpose settling over him. Instead of being humiliated by Sarah's superior abilities, he could be proud of inadvertently discovering and now protecting a genuine American hero. Thank you for trusting me with this responsibility, sir. Don't thank me yet, Morrison. Trust is earned through actions, not words. Show me that you can keep this secret, and maybe someday you'll have the opportunity to serve in similar capacities. The possibility of future special assignments gave Morrison something positive to focus on instead of his wounded pride and unsatisfied curiosity. After the call ended, Morrison sat in his barracks room, processing the conversation and its implications. Sarah wasn't just a civilian with self-defense training or even a regular military person with advanced skills. She was an intelligence operative whose work directly protected American lives. His investigation hadn't just been inappropriate, it had been potentially treasonous. The realization was sobering and educational in ways Morrison hadn't expected. For the first time since the initial incident at Murphy's bar, Morrison felt genuinely proud of his role in the story. Not because he'd solved a mystery, but because he'd been trusted to protect important secrets. His silence would contribute to operations he'd never understand, protecting fellow Americans he'd never meet. It was, Morrison realized, exactly the kind of service he'd joined the Marines to provide. 6 months after their final confrontation at Murphy's bar, Sarah Martinez stood in a classified briefing room receiving a commendation for her role in preventing a major terrorist attack on American soil. The operation had been flawless, Her cover identity had held under extreme pressure, and 3 American hostages were alive because of her actions. Deputy Director Walsh pinned the classified medal to Sarah's uniform, a decoration that would never appear in her public service record, but represented the highest honors her country could bestow for clandestine service. "Outstanding work, as always," Walsh said quietly. "Your ability to maintain operational security under challenging circumstances continues to be exemplary." Sarah accepted the commendation with professional pride, but her thoughts drifted to the young Marine whose investigation had nearly derailed her career. Morrison's discretion over the past 6 months had been absolute. He'd kept his word completely and even helped deflect casual questions from his squad mates about the mysterious woman who'd embarrassed him at Murphy's bar. "Any word on how our young friend is adjusting to his new role?" Sarah asked. Walsh smiled. "Morrison, he's exceeded all expectations. Turns out that curiosity and persistence, when properly channeled, are valuable assets in intelligence work." 3 months after Colonel Mitchell's phone call, Morrison had been quietly recruited for preliminary screening for Special Operations units. His discretion regarding Sarah's identity had been noted as evidence of his ability to handle sensitive information, and his natural investigative instincts were exactly what several classified programs needed. Morrison was currently undergoing advanced training at a facility that officially didn't exist, preparing for missions he couldn't discuss with anyone. His wounded pride had evolved into genuine purpose, and his encounter with Sarah had inadvertently launched him into exactly the kind of military career he dreamed about. "Sometimes," Walsh observed, "the most unlikely threats become the most valuable assets." Sarah nodded, remembering her initial assessment of Morrison as a simple-minded Marine with hurt feelings. His persistence and analytical thinking, while dangerous when applied to her cover identity, had proven useful when directed toward legitimate targets. "What's his current assignment?" "Counterintelligence work, actually. He's helping identify foreign operatives who target American military personnel in social settings. His experience being on the other side of an investigation gives him unique insight into how civilian-military interactions can be exploited." The irony was perfect. Morrison's inappropriate behavior toward Sarah had taught him to recognize similar tactics when used by actual enemy agents. His mistakes were helping prevent other Americans from falling victim to more sophisticated manipulation. Sarah left the briefing facility and drove to Murphy's bar, drawn by curiosity about whether Morrison had kept his word about treating her as a stranger if their paths crossed again. She'd been avoiding the establishment for months, but her successful mission and new assignment provided a good reason to celebrate. The bar had changed little in her absence. The same mix of military personnel and civilians, the same friendly atmosphere, the same corner booth where she'd first encountered Morrison's aggressive attention. Sarah ordered her usual club soda and settled in to observe the crowd. She was reading mission reports on her secure tablet when a familiar voice interrupted her concentration. "Excuse me, miss, is this seat taken?" Sarah looked up to find Morrison standing beside her booth, dressed in civilian clothes and looking markedly more mature than their previous encounters. 6 months of specialized training had added confidence to his bearing while teaching him the value of restraint. "It's open," Sarah replied carefully, curious about Morrison's approach. Morrison sat down across from her with the polite distance of a stranger making casual conversation. To anyone observing, they appeared to be 2 people meeting for the first time in a social setting. "I'm Jake," Morrison said, extending his hand. "Sarah," she replied, shaking his hand briefly. "You come here often. I haven't seen you around before." Sarah almost smiled at Morrison's careful adherence to their agreed-upon fiction. He was treating her exactly as Colonel Mitchell had instructed, as a complete stranger deserving basic politeness but no special attention. "Occasionally," Sarah said, "usually when I want some quiet time to read." Morrison nodded understanding. "I know the feeling. Sometimes you need a break from work stress." Their conversation continued for several minutes, carefully neutral and appropriately superficial. Morrison demonstrated perfect operational discipline, revealing nothing about their previous interactions while maintaining natural social interaction. Finally, Morrison excused himself to rejoin his friends at the bar, but before leaving, he turned back with apparent afterthought. I hope you don't mind me saying this, but you carry yourself like someone in law enforcement or military service. Good situational awareness. Sarah looked at him with mild surprise. What makes you say that? I'm military myself. You learn to recognize the signs. Just wanted you to know that your service is appreciated, whatever form it takes. Morrison walked away before Sarah could respond, leaving her with a mixture of admiration and amusement. His approach had been flawless, acknowledging his awareness of her true nature while maintaining her cover and expressing genuine respect for her service. More importantly, Morrison had demonstrated complete trustworthiness. He'd had numerous opportunities over 6 months to compromise her identity or reveal classified information. Instead, he'd protected her secrets while using the experience to better serve his own country. Sarah finished her drink and prepared to leave when Morrison reappeared at her table. "Sorry to bother you again," he said quietly, "but I wanted you to know that conversation we never had changed my life completely. Thank you for the lesson in discretion and the reminder about what real service looks like." Before Sarah could respond, Morrison was gone again, disappearing into the crowd with practiced ease that spoke to his new training and capabilities. Sarah sat alone for a few minutes, processing the unexpected encounter and its implications. Morrison had evolved from a threat to her operational security into a fellow intelligence professional worthy of respect and trust. His growth reminded her why their dangerous work mattered. They were protecting a country capable of turning mistakes into learning experiences and failures into future successes. As Sarah drove home that evening, she reflected on the strange journey that had brought her to this point. A drunk Marine's inappropriate behavior had nearly ended her career, but ultimately strengthened both their service to their country. Morrison's investigation had forced her to confront vulnerabilities in her cover identity, while proving that persistence and curiosity, properly directed, were valuable intelligence assets. Most importantly, their adversarial relationship had evolved into mutual respect between professionals serving the same cause through different means. Sarah's classified missions would continue protecting American interests around the world, while Morrison's new role would help identify threats to military personnel in civilian settings. The incident at Murphy's bar had taught them both important lessons about judgment, discretion, and the complex ways that service to country could manifest in everyday life. 3 weeks later, Sarah received an encrypted message while preparing for her next overseas assignment. The communication came through channels reserved for the highest classification levels, and she was surprised to see Morrison listed as the originating agent. The message was brief: foreign operative attempting to cultivate Marine personnel at Murphy's bar. Recommend immediate counterintelligence action. Operational security protocols suggest you avoid the establishment until threat is neutralized. Sarah smiled at Morrison's careful professionalism. He was protecting her cover identity while alerting appropriate authorities to a genuine security threat. His warning demonstrated exactly the kind of operational thinking that made him valuable in his new role. She sent back an equally brief acknowledgement. Message received, appreciate the professional courtesy, good hunting. 6 months later, Sarah learned through intelligence briefings that Morrison's investigation had led to the arrest of a Romanian intelligence operative who'd been systematically targeting young Marines for recruitment as information sources. Morrison's experience being inappropriately approached in a social setting had given him the insight to recognize when similar tactics were being used for espionage purposes. The foreign operative had been expelled from the United States, and several American military personnel had been protected from compromise. Morrison's work had directly contributed to safeguarding national security information and preserving the integrity of military operations. The final irony wasn't lost on Sarah. Morrison's inappropriate behavior toward her had ultimately taught him to protect other Americans from far more dangerous predators. 2 years after their first encounter at Murphy's bar, Sarah received official notification that she was being reassigned to a training role, where she would prepare the next generation of intelligence operatives for the challenges of maintaining cover identities in complex social environments. Her first class of trainees would include a case study about the importance of operational security in routine civilian interactions. The curriculum would examine how random encounters could escalate into security threats, how wounded pride could drive dangerous investigations, and how proper handling of such situations could transform adversaries into allies. The case study would be based on her own experience with a persistent Marine, whose investigation had nearly compromised her cover, but ultimately strengthened both their service to their country. Morrison, now a seasoned counterintelligence operative with several successful missions to his credit, occasionally received similar training assignments. He would teach young military personnel about the dangers of foreign recruitment attempts and the importance of reporting suspicious civilian interest in military activities. His curriculum included detailed analysis of social engineering techniques used by enemy agents to compromise American personnel. Students would learn to recognize inappropriate curiosity about military operations, resist manipulation attempts, and report potential threats to appropriate authorities. Morrison's training materials were based on his own experience investigating someone he'd assumed was a civilian, but who turned out to be far more dangerous and important than he'd ever imagined. Neither Sarah nor Morrison ever spoke publicly about their encounters at Murphy's bar, but both carried lessons from that experience throughout their continued service to their country. Their brief adversarial relationship had taught them valuable truths about judgment, discretion, and the unexpected ways that service members could find themselves serving the same cause. In the classified world where they both now operated, their story became a cautionary tale about the importance of operational security and a success story about the possibility of turning potential threats into valuable assets. The drunk Marine who'd assaulted a woman in a bar had become a counterintelligence professional protecting Americans from foreign manipulation. The special operations soldier who defended herself against harassment had become a trainer preparing the next generation for similar challenges. Both had learned that service to country took many forms, and that sometimes the most important victories came from recognizing when former adversaries could become future allies in the ongoing effort to protect American security and values. Their paths would occasionally cross in the classified world where they both now worked, always with the professional respect of colleagues who understood the complex journey that had brought them to serve the same cause through different means. The incident at Murphy's bar had ended exactly as all good intelligence operations should, with American interests protected, threats neutralized, and assets developed for future use in the ongoing defense of freedom and democracy.